Well, welcome everybody. In this video, we're going to discuss trauma. I've discussed trauma previously in one of the other videos from last year, and I think so. I think I did like a brief overview, but didn't really go into detail. And in this video, I wanted to just kind of really flesh some things out because I think people are very misinformed about trauma and just kind of misinformed about the effects of trauma. So, what is trauma? Trauma is an emotional response to a horrifying, stressful, or dangerous event, relationship, or circumstances that threatens or harms a person's health and safety, right? And a lot of us don't know it, but most people will experience at least one form of trauma in their lifetime, right? And so, there are four types of trauma that are recognized. However, you'll find several websites that have trauma listed in different ways, but the four that I'm going to name are the pretty common types that people will just kind of recognize if you say what they are. So, one is acute trauma. Right, it develops in response to a single event like a car accident, sexual assault, or a natural disaster. And I'm gonna add school shootings to that. Like, I mean, it's obvious, but I want to add it so that people can understand that even if they aren't in the direct line of fire when it comes to a school shooting, it's still a traumatic event in which to go through. That wouldn't come out. I'm getting a little tongue tied. The next one is complex trauma. This develops in response to prolonged and repeated traumatic events such as child abuse, domestic violence, or civil unrest, um, and neglect. So I'm going to flesh out the neglect, which a lot of people don't understand that neglect is one of is probably, in my opinion, one of the worst traumas, especially people who are food deprived, housing deprived. Those kids really struggle and suffer for a very, very long time. And it has brain altering effects. And it's the same way with civil unrest. So, what a lot of people don't pay attention to are the riots and the upheaval, the social upheaval we've had here lately. Those are things that can cause trauma to people. Some folks have gotten to the point where they don't want to watch news. They don't want to be involved in what's going on with day to day life because that secondary trauma is just too much for them. And that's going to be the second thing that I talk about, secondary or vicarious trauma, right? So that develops in response to witnessing someone else's trauma. So typical among therapists, first responders, healthcare providers, and so on. I have been thankful that I haven't struggled with any secondary or vicarious trauma, although I've heard some pretty challenging or just really to horrific things. But I've done really well. When I feel like I need to talk to somebody about it, I'll talk to somebody about it. So in anyway, like again, I just have done a really good job trying to take care of myself, and I want to repeat that because whenever you work in a helping profession, you need to take context. I recently had a client who was having trouble in her relationship and having difficulty connecting with her partner, and just kind of having this just anger. And the conclusion we came to is that she had worked in rape crisis for so long that the way she viewed men changed. And so she had the secondary and vicarious trauma symptoms. And we had to just kind of work through that. And it was difficult for her to work through it because she was like, I've never been a victim. I've never been in the position where let me correct that. I've never been victimized. Let me say that. And it was just really, really hard for her to just kind of navigate through that. So it's very important to get some help if you work in a helping profession where you're helping people in which they are traumatized. Generational trauma is passed down from one generation to the next, particularly when it's experienced by a collective group, such as slavery and genocide. There's all sorts of cultures who have been affected by slavery and genocide, and you can see the effects of that ripple throughout the community. Um, and so it has long lasting effects, and that's some of what we're going to talk about, like physiological changes that happen when you're stressed over time. Um, our trauma responses, it usually happens in three stages, right? The emergency response. So right after the traumatic event, you may experience a psychological shock, right? An acute stress response is what it's called. In the psychological shock, your body is overwhelmed with emotion, which can show up in a variety of physical symptoms, right? That's one of the physiological changes that can happen, that acute stress response. So, a rush of adrenaline may result in shakiness, rapid heartbeat, difficulty breathing, nausea, tightness to your chest. These symptoms represent your body flight or fight response is getting ready for immediate action in order to survive, right? Um, Research has expanded the idea of fighting, becoming aggressive or screaming or fleeing, running away to include two additional emergency responses, right? Freezing, staying still, avoiding decisions, or feeling numb or disconnected. And I feel like these were added because sometimes when people do nothing, it's seen as just that, doing nothing, and it's not identified as freezing. Like, this is, if I do nothing, then I'll stay alive. That's a survival, right? And then fawning, trying to please others to avoid conflict. So that can go along with bullying. Sometimes kids that are bullied will do things and to either make the bully like them, or either help do things to for the bully to avoid them, like joining into the teasing and bullying sometimes. Short term processing. I don't know what's with my tongue today. So, in the days and weeks that follow your trauma, that you return to some sense of normalcy or routine, right? During this adjustment, you may experience grief, stress, flashbacks, which some people call re-experiencing. You may also develop a trauma or stress-related disorder that keeps you from recovering fully. And we're going to talk about those stress related disorders later on. So, long term recovery, that's the last stage. So in this stage, you'll learn to make meaning from your trauma and integrate what you've experienced into your life story. Right, you're able to accept what has happened without reliving your trauma endlessly. And so it takes time to get through these stages. Having experienced trauma myself, I can definitely look back on my life and see the stages. Honestly, probably not the first one, that emergency response, um, because by the time, you know, when I think about my trauma, it's because it was complex. It was persistent over time. I can't think of that like initial trigger, but I can think of the short term processing and the long term recovery, because that's actually where I am now. So, trauma and perception. Trauma relies on your own perception of danger and safety, meaning different people go through the same stressful experience and have different trauma responses. So, not no one person's trauma is going to be the same as another person's trauma, right? So, if you take three roommates that were home during an earthquake, right? The first person may develop trauma symptoms that resolve in a few days or weeks. The second roommate symptoms may linger for months and eventually develop into post traumatic stress disorder. The third person may not be traumatized at all because they've lived in an area that was like earthquake prone their entire life, right? So The third roommate had experience with in context for what was going on. So they understood earthquakes. They've lived through earthquakes before, so that they know what's happening, so they can remain calm. The second roommate, the one that eventually uh, acquired PTSD, didn't realize the earthquake was minor, so they thought they were going to die. So that would explain for the PTSD. And so even though they weren't technically in danger, their perception of danger still caused a serious trauma response. And that really matters, because although, again, and it's possible that the earthquake may not have traumatized somebody if that was their first time going through an earthquake, and but they have been exposed to natural disasters in the past, and you know, so and I'm mentioning that so people won't get too technical about that piece. And so in doing my research and finding like really good websites to just kind of discuss trauma, of course I do have my own history, but I like to, I mean, my own information, but I like to stay up to date. And so I found this really great website that talked about big T trauma and little t trauma. And I did get a lot of my background information from this website, because I think they did a really good job laying things out. And so, because trauma depends on the individual's emotional response, many different circumstances can count as trauma, right? Therapists often use the big T trauma and the little t trauma to help us understand how seemingly small things can traumatize us, right? So, big T trauma refers to clearly dangerous and extreme events we already associate with trauma, right? So, war, natural disasters, physical and sexual violence, mass shootings, terrorist attacks, severe accidents. Those are things that are all acceptable. That if you tell anybody those things, they would go, ah, got it. Oh, that makes sense, right? But little t refers to events and circumstances that are life altering but not life threatening. So these situations may seem ordinary, but they can still produce a trauma response and damage the mental health. And I think these are the ones that people have um, difficulty accepting, because their experience may have been different. So divorce, bullying, getting fired, unresolved relational conflicts, financial or legal trouble. It's and so again, if people don't identify with that, like if I were bullied, then it didn't traumatize me, then you shouldn't be traumatized just for a quote unquote little bullying, right? So it's important to expand your definition of trauma beyond just the big T, because again, these little traumas, little T traumas, are the things that can build up over time and cause the kind of severe symptoms that usually come from big traumas, from big T traumas, right? So the effects of trauma harms or threatens to harm our physical, mental, or emotional well-being, right? So different kinds of traumatic events can jeopardize different areas of our health. And most forms of trauma affect us in way more than one way, right? So let's say you get into a car accident, you break your leg, and while the physical trauma of a broken leg is visible, the emotional trauma of the experience may be less obvious. And so, and these unresolved emotions may affect you psychologically by showing up as fear and panic anytime you get in a car. Anytime it looks like you're about to have a near miss, or a car is following too closely. All of that creates emotional and psychological stress. Um, Emotional or psychological trauma can also express itself physically. For example, if you're struggling with a psychological trauma of divorce or breakup, you might develop physical symptoms like insomnia, appetite changes, and muscle tension. I actually had um, a client who struggled with abdominal migraines because of his stressors, that he had a little t trauma, and that stressor caused an abdominal migraine. The stomach aches could sometimes be mild to debilitating, and this child was having a really difficult time. But once we talk through just kind of some anxiety some techniques to just use to reduce his anxiety, to coping strategies to make him feel better, or to distract him if needed. He started to feel better over time. So let's talk about those um, other symptoms that just kind of come along with traumas that you can just kind of feel in your body, right? So you can have panic attacks. Some people get those, get panic attacks. You can get headaches, again, stomach ache, the nausea. Some people can get high blood pressure from stress responses, and that will eventually lead to heart conditions or other diseases that manifest in your body. So, trauma and taking care of the symptoms that come along with trauma. Well, excuse me, taking care of the symptoms that come along with trauma. Trauma is very important, and also resolving the trauma so that it will in turn lessen the symptoms that you're trying to manage through. I hope that makes sense because I felt like I muddled that, but the gist of it is take care of yourself, no matter what way you do it, backwards or forwards. Take care of yourself, because trauma and the symptoms that go with it, they have to be resolved so that you can have a better outlook, long term, in regards to your physical, mental, and emotional health. um, Common trauma disorders is sometimes your trauma responses will develop into a mental health disorder, right? Um, and these disorders are just kind of grouped in together, in their trauma or stress related disorders. Common ones include, that everybody knows and that find acceptable, is post traumatic stress disorder. It occurs when trauma symptoms last more than a month after the trauma happened, right? So PTSD symptoms include intrusive memories, avoidance, cognition, which is thinking, and mood changing, and heightened reactivity, which people call hypervigilance. I just talked to a client today about hypervigilance. He was saying that he could now, like, if something was dangerous, he could basically suss it out before everybody else in the room does. If his parents, because when he was younger growing up, he could tell when his parents were upset or somebody else in the family was going to blow up, just kind of after these traumatic things happened to him. And I had to point out to him that's hypervigilance. And he still feels it now. So hypervigilance is a part of that fight or flight response, where your body tenses up and it feels like, okay, we're going to die, we're in danger, we need to keep ourselves safe. So can you imagine what that must feel like, or what that does to your body, feeling like that all the time, or feeling that off and on long term? It's not good for you. So that's why it's important to just kind of resolve these trauma triggers and symptoms. So, acute stress disorder, ASD, it occurs when trauma symptoms last for less than a month after a trauma happened, right? So, PTSD is over a month, ASD is less than a month. Adjustment disorders. It involves the difficulty of adjusting to a stressful event. These disorders persist up up to 6 months after the event has ended. And so adjustment disorder is another temporary. It's up to 6 months. And so anything past 6 months, after a little while, you're going to have to diagnose that client with something else. And you're going to have to figure out what umbrella it fits under, because during the time of doing therapy under the diagnosis of adjustment disorder, you would have gotten enough information to diagnose them with something else. So there's a lot of disorders that just can kind of happen again, and with a childhood disorder, childhood trauma. And I felt like this was important to know, because if you're a young person listening to this video and you are diagnosed with these disorders, it although it's a part of childhood trauma, sometimes when people diagnose you with these disorders, they forget that it's a part of the childhood trauma, and they label you as something else. So one of the most popular ones is ODD, which is oppositional defiant disorder. A lot of children have this, right? So let's say if it's um, a young rape victim, like 14 years old, right? The true diagnosis should be PTSD. Or let's say if it wasn't a rape victim, it was a child, it was a molestation victim that also had issues with neglect. The true diagnosis should be complex PTSD. However, because the child may live in a certain demographic, or the child may look a certain way, or the child presents as angry and not much else, they'll get what's called ODD, which is oppositional defiant disorder, right? So if you go to school and you have that ODD, that oppositional defiant disorder, when children see that, not children, but when teachers see that, it's going to be, oh, this person is oppositional. That means they're a problem. Oh, I have to keep my eye on them. And so everything you do, it doesn't look like trauma. It looks like it's oppositional. Oppositional is it's a bad thing in their opinion, right? And so I have to get this oppositional child in check, this defiant child in check. And what typically happens is that you start to butt heads with that teacher or feel a certain way about that teacher because they're not understanding that you have been traumatized. And so I think instead of going to and having an outright war with the teacher, get your parents involved or get someone involved that will advocate for you, that will explain that, hey, that's not, this child is typically, or this person is not typically oppositional, but this is what they've gone through, and they're working through how to express or whatever. Like, you don't have to, and I don't want to say that in the sense that you have to give an account of everything you've been through, but you can say this child has been through a trauma and we're working through that in therapy, and boom, that's it. Nobody needs to know the details unless you want to share the details. So disassociation. Many children disassociate as a way to cope with trauma. So disassociation means detracting from yourself or from reality in order to protect yourself. It's depersonalization, derealization disorder is one of the types of dissociative disorders, and is commonly triggered by trauma. And that just means you are really detaching. Some people, you can tell when they're disassociating. They look completely blank. They look like they're not there. They look like they're in the zone. I mean, and it's not just the kind of in the zone where you shake your head like, "Ooh, where did I go?" really quickly. Like, it's, for some people, it's very visible. Um, and for some people, it can look a lot like daydreaming, but not, like zoned out daydreaming, like click, 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 come back in. And so that looks a certain way too. Like, some people will claim that that's inattentive. So if you think about it, you have a kid that has ODD, that have a habit of disassociating. So now this child looks like, okay, so you're bad and you're not paying attention. Oh, that is too much. We are calling your mother, right? And so that's just people not understanding what trauma looks like for children. And then cognitive struggles. Cognitive is a fancy word for thinking. So if a child experiences or witnesses trauma as a child, they may struggle cognitively. For example, if you're repressing memories from your childhood trauma, you might struggle to remember not just those traumatic memories, but other details related to that. Another thing is too, like, if a child is exposed to domestic violence. Now, mind you, they're not going to come to school and look like they've been beaten, like they've been hurt, but they watch their mom or dad or whoever else in the house. They watch them being abused, and they've seen these traumatic things. That child is going to have trouble focusing, right? Paying attention, thinking things through, just giving you the answer that you expect. It's going to be too difficult, but then people don't understand that, because what's your problem? You should be able to figure this out. You should be able to think this through. Um, there's so many mental health challenges except like associated with trauma. And trauma can trigger so many disorders, right? Anxiety, depression, addiction, eating disorders, OCD. It can just it can just affect so many things. Okay, so one of the things I want to go back to and highlight, and I think I said in the previously that I would go back and just kind of discuss this thing, is just understanding that residual trauma and just constantly feeling like you're getting ready for the next attack or life altering event. Like holding yourself to that is that hypervigilance is what most people call it, when you're preoccupied with a real or imagined threat, that results, for some people it can result into fear, rage, or disappointment, and you feel all of that in your body, right? That muscle tension is always happening, because with hypervigilance, you're usually just kind of tensed up. Your parasympathetic nervous system is activated, and you're going to feel that. A lot of times, when people feel that just kind of fear, that exhaustion that comes out of that prolonged fear response, I have seen people sleep for such a long time because finally they are just kind of exhausted, and that's, they're just over it, right? So trauma has a severe impact, um, on your body. It rewires your brain. You don't think the same anymore. You don't respond the same. You don't react. It's almost like, I heard this in grad school. It's a very extreme response. But if you think about an egg, like trauma is the egg that dropped on the floor. Like the egg is still egg, but it has a different shape, different form. Everything is different, except for like the components of it being an egg. Okay, so I read this thing in Psychology Today about animals and how they're able to just kind of shake off that freeze response. When you just kind of get stuck and you don't move. When some animals suffer trauma, they do that. They just kind of shake off all of that energy, that hypervigilance, that fear that they felt. They just kind of shake it off. What I found interesting, um, is two things. One, that shaking like a leaf is commonly described, as is that it's basically the shaking or trembling, which comes from the limbic brain, and so that's the part of the brain that holds emotion, and so that's the brain altering, shift. It sends a signal that there's danger, and then it'll send the signal that danger has passed. So all of that shifting is happening back and forth, and it's letting your body know that, okay, we were in high alert, now we have to calm down. But there are long term effects if your body stays in that high alert. So the second example that I found very interesting is that if certain animals, if they can't shake off that trauma response, that freeze response, they will die. So if that happens to animals, imagine what happens to us long term. So um, it's absolutely working towards finding finding some help for yourself and figuring out how to just take care of yourself when it comes to lessening that hypervigilance, dealing with the symptoms of post traumatic stress disorder or acute stress disorder, just and the symptoms. Okay, so I wanted to make what I said more clear. When it comes to just taking care of the symptoms, which means don't hold things on in your body, right? If you're feeling upset, if you're feeling afraid, If you're whatever you're feeling, try to find someone, a therapist if you can, to just kind of share those feelings with, so you can just kind of talk through what's happening with you, because you can't leave that in your body. I'm a firm believer that once you give a voice to something, it's easier for you to just kind of um, to handle it, to process through it. Um, Change the way you take care of yourself, like eat differently, sleep differently, exercise, walk, do whatever you can to just feel like you're in control versus the symptoms managing you and taking control over you. I mean, understand that you're resilient, right? People are genuinely resilient, and the good news is that you'll be able to live a healthy and fulfilling life even after experiencing trauma. But you have to make sure that you show yourself compassion and put yourself first, that so that you can, just kind of work through it, work through things in a healthy way. So one key to healing is finding people, again, who can support you. If it's not a therapist, um, you can find friends and families and other types of professionals. And the reason why I'm suggesting other types of professionals is that victims advocates can be very good as a support system, not in lieu of therapy, but support. Social workers can be, really great people that will support you. Priests, pastors, all of those places you can go if you feel uncomfortable with a therapist. And of course, I am going to suggest therapy because I am a therapist. But if you have experienced trauma or violence, you can also just talk to your healthcare providers, right, about what you've gone through, because doctors and nurses are all there to support you too. And to remember that you don't have to go into detail. And I feel like sometimes we people think they need to overshare, or they need you to give you all the information in order for them to feel supported, and you really don't need to do that. You share what's comfortable for you for you in that moment. And the reason why I'm saying that is because some people will share, and during that sharing process, it's possible for you to re-experience. It's possible for you to go right back into that fight or flight mode, that fear, because I'm talking about this, something has activated, and now I feel like, oh my gosh, it's happening again. And so that's why I suggest talking to a professional that can just, handle that part, talk you through some relaxation exercises, help you understand what you're feeling, and just, make you feel at ease. Maybe not long term in that moment, because I'm talking about a moment when you feel that way, but but feel good for that moment, and then just help you understand that you can trust people. So again, you don't need to go in detail, but it's you have to share something. You have to share to a certain extent to just kind of get it out of your body. And like I said, a good provider will want to be a part of your healing journey. Your friends or families that want to support you, they want to be a part of your healing journey. And then also, you know, with a provider, they'll help you find resources. Helping professionals will help you find resources, and that's really what you need. You need support, and you need resources. But remember, again, like when it comes to the gory details, you don't share anything that you're uncomfortable with. Your story is yours to tell, and no one else's. And don't feel obligated. You can absolutely say, "I'm sorry, I don't feel comfortable sharing." Or it makes me uncomfortable that you would ask me such a personal question. I found that the last one usually just kind of shuts everything down. Um, so that is the last of my video, and I will see you guys on the next video. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you all.